if we kind of rewind back and reflect back on our very first panel of the day, the one with Ann, Chris, Courtney, and Mary, it was pretty evident that women's sports are the most popular that they've ever been. There's a hunger for them, yet there's this disparity between men's and women's games in terms of revenue, in terms of airtime, media coverage, and fans, and accessibility. So how do we catch up? This is the time to kind of capitalize on the popularity that we know is there for women's sports, but how do we deliver? So what can we learn from the men's games? How can we play catch up? And what things can we take from the past, positive, negative, that we have learned on the men's side? So our next panel is going to be sports sponsorship and integrity, commercializing the women's game. So with that, I would like to invite up Megan Perry, Vice President, Executive Engagement and Women's Initiative at Sports Innovation Lab. Going to be moderating. Yes. Also would like to welcome Allie Braverman, Head of Revenue, Just Women's Sports Media. Allison Giordano, Vice President, Global Sponsorship and Consumer Marketing for MasterCard, Vice Chair. And last but not least, John Patrikoff, yep, come on in, CEO and co-founder, Athletes Unlimited, and board member for New York City Football Club.
Perfect. Okay, you guys can hear me okay? Excellent. So listen, we are here to talk about commercializing women's sports. And I think it's no secret to anyone in this room and those watching us online that women's sports is on the rise. It's been trending for a long time. And the thing is that the rest of the world is finally starting to pay attention. There's traction. But the problem is that what we've all known and felt for a really long time hasn't quite translated into that revenue column. So we're here to talk about how to do that. How do we bridge that gap? So I'm really excited to dive in, unpack how do we make women's sports not something that is just something nice to be a part of, but where's the money? There is so much money being left on the table. There's so much untapped business potential, and we really want to talk about how do we take it to the next level. So let's unpack that. I have a very esteemed panel and some guests that I can talk that are going to dive in with me specifically. So I want to take a moment and have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about myself as well at the end. But let's start with Allie Braverman. Tell us a little bit more about your background, your role, and specifically the question to you is how are you impacting women's sports?
Yeah, hi everyone, happy to be here. I'm Allie Braverman, Head of Revenue at Just Women's Sports, and Just Women's Sports is a consumer-facing digital media company that exclusively covers women's sports, so not trying to hide anything with our name. We say we're 100% women's sports, 100% of the time, and yeah, really excited to be here. And we're trying to build basically the one-stop shop for everything you need in women's sports. So you go to justwomensports.com and it is the homepage on the internet of women's sports. And our approach to content is really predicated on consistency, access, and depth. Women's sports fans, they're fans year-round, not just during the Olympics or the WNBA Finals or the World Cup. So making sure we have that consistent, comprehensive, meaningful coverage. So to your question, I mean, women's sports is all that we do at Just Women's Sports and trying to increase the visibility of the game through media coverage.
So my name is Allie as well, Allie Giordano. I am Vice President of Consumer Marketing and Sponsorships here at MasterCard. I have a remit that looks after our global sports properties, but I also look after our global women's sponsorship investments, which is really very exciting and is really a privilege to do so. Why we're invested in women's sports, or why we're...
Yeah, but how are you impacting?
How are we impacting? You know, I think, you know, my leader, Michael Robichaux, when we started down this path, you know, years back, the focus was really on their investment has to be there, but it's also advising and advocating and making sure we're creating an opportunity to showcase women's sports, showcase these amazing role models in content and above the line. So I think, you know, what MasterCard tries to do is really align with properties and partners that share our values. We think that we are strategically building that right portfolio to drive outcomes that are good for our business and our brand. And you know, there's still more work to do though.
Absolutely. John?
So I'm John Patrickoff. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Athletes Unlimited. Athletes Unlimited was started 2 years ago, and today we run 4 pro women's sports leagues in the United States. We run the only pro women's lacrosse league, the only pro indoor volleyball league in the United States, the pro softball league, and just launched and completed our first season in professional women's basketball, which is a complement to the WNBA season. For those who don't know, about 70% of the WNBA players have historically gone overseas. This year, for the first time, they had the opportunity to play pro ball here in the United States. It's been an amazing 2-year journey. I started out in this path after having a long career in media and entertainment, really with the belief that there was a huge commercial opportunity in women's professional sports, and that there was a big opportunity that should be pursued. We've taken a very different approach, though, than building a traditional sports league that are those that you typically hear about. Each of our leagues runs over the course of 5 weeks in one city. We bring together 4 teams worth of the best athletes in that sport, and they compete over a 5-week season where they compete and change teams each week, actually, and accumulate points based on how well they do and how well their teams do. So it's an individual leaderboard, it's innovative, and I think we're doing a couple things at the same time. One is we're creating new opportunities and taking advantage of the opportunity in women's sports, but also tremendously innovating around how pro team sports have been organized in this country before, and think that hopefully will open up a big new fan base and that we can commercialize.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, John. I think it's really hard to talk about women's sports and not talk about innovation. I think they go hand in hand. And one thing I want to start with Allie G. This will be Allie Giordano and Allie Braverman. So Allie G and Allie B. Yeah, so we'll start with Allie G. At MasterCard has a long history of really being engaged with the women's sports community. And I want to understand from your vantage point, what specifically motivated you, your team, and your role to lean into women's sports, and what's your strategic approach to doing so?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Megan. I think there's 2 sides to that. One is our marketing strategy is centered around experiences and passions. It's something that our brand platform Priceless is founded in, 25 years and running, and we're really about delivering fans that amazing experience, getting them closer to the game, getting closer to the athlete or the talent that they crave and that they follow. So that's sort of our wheelhouse. And so to be able to naturally extend into women's sports was perfect, right? If you think about reaching new audiences, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit about the fan project, but you have a very engaged audience when you're talking about women's sports. They cross over multiple sports. They're tech savvy, et cetera. So it really, again, was a natural extension to really complement our existing sports portfolio specifically. But it didn't happen overnight. If you look back probably 10 plus years, and you look at our leadership, starting with our former CEO, Ajay Banga, Ann Cairns, our vice chair, who you heard from this morning, and some other leaders, they really leaned in on gender equity for our company specifically. And it was about us making sure that we're doing the things internally first, whether it's having equal pay for men and women at MasterCard, whether it's creating the services and benefits to benefit both men and women across the board, across the globe, as needed in the different markets. So that's where they started, but then it really expanded and sort of blossomed into a steer code that Randall helps chair with Ann, and you heard from him earlier. And we're focused not only on employees, which is critical, and they're the voice of our brand, but we also look at society. We're a big player in financial inclusion around the world, microfinance, et cetera. And so that's another area that we really look at in terms of gender equity. And then lastly is the commercial opportunity. So here we are, a huge investor in sponsorship, sports specifically. It was a no-brainer. How can we transition our brand values, our mission as a company to have equity, and then transfer that to everything we do, whether it be with employee society or in the commercial space, specifically in sponsorships and other areas that we go to market in with product, et cetera. So it was really kind of both sides of the coin.
Got it, got it. Allie B, question for you. When we talk about fans of women's sports, there's tremendous opportunity to engage the fans that are, we call them at Sports Innovation Lab, these digitally savvy, fluid fans, if you will. And for those that may not be familiar with that term, what that means is that the fans that are fluid, they are empowered to choose. They're not just a fan of like one team. They're not just a super fan. They follow athletes. They follow different teams. They're immersed in conversations that cross different platforms. And so, Allie, specifically with women's sports, a lot of the fans have been pushed into this space, this online space that we're all familiar with here. But from a content perspective and what you guys are doing with just women's sports, how are you embracing the fans of women's sports and the opportunity to meet them where they are in that digital space?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. I think a couple things in our approach. One is we just want to make it incredibly easy to be a fan and meet people where they are, how they like to consume media. I imagine most people here follow women's sports, or at least have tried to, and you've probably noticed you have to do a ton of homework on the most basic aspects of fandom, like literally as basic as what women's sports leagues exist, what teams exist, when are the games, how do I watch the games? Like if that basic level of information isn't available and accessible, I don't know how we're going to build fandom in women's sports. Like you just like need the table stakes, schedule, stats, scoreboard. And then with our approach to content, two things just to comment on what you said. One is we've really taken this multi-channel approach, and it's definitely digital first. So we want to say, you know, if you're into podcasts and you have an hour a week, you want to learn about women's sports, like we've got that for you. And if you just have 10 minutes a week to be a women's sports fan, we have a newsletter for you to give you everything you need in the world of women's sports. So really trying to meet people where they are, how they like to consume media. And to your point, like so often women's sports fans have been shut out of the traditional channels. And then the second thing, and I think some of this was strategy, some of this was luck of when just women's sports started, which was right as COVID hit, is we've really taken an athlete-first approach to content. We have our neutral, objective, you know, true journalists like coverage. But for a lot of our premium content, it's hosted by current professional athletes. So we have a podcast with Kelly O'Hara, Sam Mewis, Lynn Williams. We have a video series with Allie Riley. We have a podcast with Dawn Staley. So really taking advantage of what you said, these fluid fans that even if they didn't grow up in Washington, D.C., where Kelly O'Hara plays, they're still a big, they're Kelly O'Hara fans. So allowing these women to tell their own stories in their own words with an athlete-first approach to content.
Love that, love that. John, I'm coming to you in just a second because what I want to loop our audience into is Sports Innovation Lab. We released this report called The Fan Project, and it talks a lot about how do we create a model to really engage fans of women's sports, right? And one of the major takeaways from that is, one, that fans of women's sports, they're digitally savvy, right? We also know that fans of women's sports respond to storytelling and a focus on the athlete. So specifically, my question for you, John, is strategically, when you were thinking about developing Athletes Unlimited, you guys have done things in kind of a non-traditional or unconventional format, right? Where there's no general managers, there's no coaches, there's not a lot of the governing bodies that exist. You guys have leaned into positioning the athletes at the center and telling their stories. So can you talk about why you did that and the opportunity that you saw with that format?
Absolutely. So I think, I love how Ali said, look at our name, Just Women's Sports. So look at our name, which is Athletes Unlimited. You know, the athletes are at the center of the organization. And one thing that's very unique is not only are we running 4 leagues under one umbrella, but the league, the teams, and the athletes are part of one organization. And so we're kind of this one-stop shop. And the athletes are involved at every level of governance. So we have athlete representation on the board of directors. Each sport that we run, each league that we run, has a player executive committee made up of 5 of the women in the league, and we meet with them weekly. They're involved in every level of decision making. They've helped us develop all of our effective policies, work with us on our policies across the board, our partnerships, our media strategies. So what we have is their buy-in and their involvement across the board, and it really opens up a tremendous amount of avenues. But one of the key premises when we started Athletes Unlimited, and it came from the fluid fan work, was first, I should say there are 2. One was that fans of the future are following athletes more than they're following fixed teams, and certainly there's legacy brands and legacy leagues, and there's team affinity there. But if you're starting a league from scratch today, I really believe that you want to lean into the athlete affinity that the fans have. So that was one. And the second was the importance of the storytelling. So for each of our seasons, games are nationally broadcast. You can watch them on television, you can watch them on digital platforms, but we emphasize the storytelling aspect. So when you watch that broadcast, you're going to learn about the players, you're going to learn about their stories, you're going to learn about their lives off the court and off the field, as well as you're going to see the great highlights. And so that storytelling is at the crux of what we're trying to deliver, and we think that's what fans care about. They want to know about these athletes, they want to connect with them, they care about what they care about, not just who and what they do on the court, but what they do off the court.
Allie B, question back to you and your team. Where do you see the biggest opportunity when people say, no one watches women's sports, oh, there's no butts in the seats, oh, the numbers are low? There's data that disproves that, first of all. It's a myth. But second, we understand that women's sports fans are in spaces that just are not being captured. There's no metric right now, really, to capture all the activity and engagement that we see in women's sports. So my question to you really is, where do you see the most traction with content creators and people that are actually consuming women's sports?
I mean, fans are just so hungry for anything. Like, to be honest, like, there's traction in so many areas. So first, to combat the myth that people aren't watching women's sports, I mean, whether it's data from Sports Innovation Lab, like, viewership is up, attendance is up, e-commerce, like merch sales are up, sponsorships are up. If you're plugged into the space, like, that's not true. And for people who aren't plugged in the space, it's bringing them the hard data to combat that myth. Specifically, I think in the US, I mean, the WNBA, the NWSL, Athletes Unlimited, the basketball season that just finished. I mean, there's so much hype and excitement. So yeah, I mean, fans are just hungry for any content. And I think what we're seeing specifically is when you create content specifically for women's sports fans and you distribute it on a platform that they expect to receive it, engagement rates are off the charts. Like, where women's sports storytelling and content doesn't work is where you jam it into a traditional media network where the fans are coming because they want men's sports content. Right. And pull up your phones and go to a traditional sports Instagram feed and look at the comments from the last time they posted about women's sports. Like, you're trying to jam it in a place where it just doesn't fit. But if you put it in the right ecosystem, if you're experts in engaging the fan base, like, the content just does incredibly well.
Allie G, question for you. Back to you. We're just bouncing back and forth. Yeah. Oh, I hope in a good way. When you talk about investing in sponsorship of women's sports, athletes, teams, properties, what have been some of the biggest hesitations that you've seen from other, no names, but executives on the global stage? And then, like, what from MasterCard, what did you guys see that said, hey, we have to lean into this opportunity right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think Allie B touched on it a little bit. It fit with our ethos as a company, to go there, and it fit with our marketing strategy. So, and now the fact that we have tools like the Fan Project and the work that Katie's doing at SIL, like that just helps sort of tell the story, and the with media numbers going up and just having this engaged content and people knowing about it. It's a no-brainer. I think the metrics, when I talk to other brands, having sort of this approach of doing apples to apples and having those media metrics match, let's say a Champions League, right? It's just not. It's not there. It's not going to be there for a while, right? So if you're taking a traditional model of evaluating, how you've done traditional men's sports on a global stage, just assuming like, oh, this, we have to just compare it. It's, that I think is probably a large hesitation for brands. Good news though, there's a lot of momentum, and as Allie and John and we all know here on the stage, there's data now, right? And so hopefully you have people who are willing to kind of stand up and say, let's take a look. Let's go after this new audience. We have some proof points now to show.
We do.
Yeah.
We do, absolutely. And I'll just throw some out there, if you will. But specifically, I think what makes the opportunity, because that's something we struggle with, I think, in the women's sports community is, well, where are the numbers, right? And you want to be able to back that up. And when we talk about women's sports and the opportunity to drive investment across the entire landscape, I think one thing we're missing is that, or people are missing, is that women's sports fans, or fans of women's sports, let me be specific, they are the early adopters. They are the ones that are already there in those digital spaces during COVID, the height of COVID. They were the ones that knew how to access those streams. Like, they were already ahead of the curve. And when you talk about the early adopters, well, why should we invest in women's sports? And I know you guys will back me up with this, is while fans of women's sports might be like, I think the number is 10% of that fan base, they make up 50% of the revenue. So fans of women's sports are the innovators. Fans of women's sports are the future of sports. And so you're missing out on the opportunity, and you're leaving potentially billions of dollars on the table if you're not paying attention and if you're not engaging them specifically, right?
Can I add one?
Yeah, please.
So just on the way we talk about women's sports too, is I think sometimes we perpetuate the myth that you shouldn't invest in women's sports, or you should, but only because it's a charity, and some of the language we use. Like, you just hear too often people, brands, whoever, like talking about women's sports as it's a charity, and it's not. Like, it's a business to invest in that has a return, and even if you're starting in the space because you think it's a charity, like, please be open-minded that it's not, and that it'll drive investment. So I think also, like, the people, some of it is just cleaning up our language when we use it, to not say brands come to the table because it's a good thing to do. It is a good thing to do, but it also will have, like, incredible returns for your business.
Yeah, and I think there are two parts of that. I mean, what I see most of the time in conversations with potential partners is this balance. On the one hand, one of the reasons we run 4 leagues and 4 sports that gives us 120 games in 4 different cities is because I do believe scale matters to marketers. It does. But when you start to have that conversation, then the real conversation starts about what can we do from an integration standpoint? What can we really do that'll be meaningful, that'll add value? And so for that, you have to have the resources on your team to be creative enough and work to activate, because I know partners come and they've got a lot going on, and they can't do all the work themselves, right? So for us, I've seen consistently that you really have to bring both. You have to bring, as a property, the scale that sometimes cannot exist in new areas, and women's sports has not historically existed. The leagues are smaller, don't have as many teams, don't have as much reach, but then you also need to bring that creativity and ability to really talk about how you're going to integrate on a meaningful level.
Just a point on that, it's very interesting. If you look at COVID and the impact it had and everything going virtual, right? It almost forced a shift in how brands activated their rights, right? So live event was dead for a period of time. Everything had to move online. And so the properties that, we work with some amazing brands that have been represented here today, they had to shift. They had to change kind of how they were delivering value to us and the other brands that invest in them. And I feel like that kind of everything sort of had been like a perfect storm. And there's now an expectation, I would say, at least from us, that they come to the table, our partners come to the table, and they're willing, and we co-create together, and the audience is looking for the content. So,
Allie, can you even piggyback on that more and talk about some of the benefits that have come from partnering with, women's sports organizations? What is that return on investment? Like, a lot of times you'll sit in meetings and boardrooms. I'm sure there's people that haven't been exposed or maybe have hesitations, but can you shed some light on all of the benefits that come with aligning yourself with women's sports specifically that may not exist in other spaces?
Yeah, I mean, I guess first and foremost, you heard from 2 of our ambassadors today, Alex Scott and Crystal Dunn. You pretty much have an entire new audience of role models to be able to engage with. And for us, it's twofold. It's one, it's come from our belief system, really showcasing these amazing women, working with them to help drive brand and business drivers for us. But at the same time, one of our teams in South Africa, talks about, grassroots to greatness, right? And how do we then also work with our partners, work with our ambassadors to inspire and drive that next generation, which also ties back to what we stand for and what we're trying to do with, girls in technology and getting girls and getting them engaged in tech, getting them engaged in sport, and keeping them there past that middle school age. So there's sort of a nice, circle there, and It's not a difficult conversation for us internally. Our organization from the top is behind it. And I think it's just because at the center of what we do as a company, it's aligned. So it makes sense.
Well, talking about values alignment specifically, and John, I know that Athletes Unlimited has really leaned into that and really helping, I think, raise the bar and drive investment for not only just AU, but just women's sports in general. So can you share more about what AU is doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when talking about this. I never know exactly how to say it, because to me, it should just be an obvious part of any organization that's being built today and that's growing today. I mean, your values should be at the center of what you do. And so for us, we've consistently leaned into the concept of uplifting the athletes as civic leaders, and that involvement that they have in what we do, but also in how we can support them in their lives, both on the field and on the court, but also about what they do outside of it. And so one great example is we have an Athletes Causes program. The athletes earn bonuses at the end of the season based on performance, and then we match that by 50%, and it goes to a cause of their choice. So the athletes, yes, we have some partners at the league level that we're supporting and causes we support as a league, but we are really focused on how we can help them support the causes they want to support. And I think once you all of a sudden turn that around and put their voice and their decision making, it creates a level, and Allie and I were talking, and I love hearing this comment. You see the enjoyment and positivity with which the athletes bring, and I think that's what fans love, and that's what fans respond to. And I think if I could just bottle that up and sell that, I'd do that all day long, because that is what people are looking for. And so, and I think what's amazing for partners like MasterCard and others is you have the ability to kind of help us do that, and as you said, co-create and deliver that experience. And to me, there's a lot of focus on many things in sports, but I think the athlete and the athlete experience and the athlete voices has to be at the forefront. Allie B, question to you about how are you at Just Women's Sports and your team, how are you helping to continue to drive conversations that are more values aligned? Because we've seen that there is a large response by fans of women's sports whenever you have those value-driven conversations. We are all very familiar with the WNBA and the conversations around them in 2020, around social justice specifically, and we see spikes of engagement when similar topics come up. So from a content standpoint, what are you guys focused on at Just Women's Sports?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One is just ensuring that we're treating the athlete as a person and showing the full scope of what it means to be an athlete, and that includes those values-aligned conversations, but it also means showing them playing and competing and sweating and celebrating and bleeding, like all the things that it means to be an athlete. So we put a ton of attention on, we want to show these women being athletes on the court or field or whatever, and also the full scope of what it means to be a human. So I think what we have seen in women's sports media is actually almost the opposite problem of what we're talking about, is it focuses exclusively on the values, and it never hits on these women as amazing world-class athletes. And it's a little insulting to them that we never talk about that. So I think it's balancing, of course, these really compelling personal stories. And like you said, hearing from Crystal earlier, like she's a human and a person before being an athlete. But also, Crystal is amazing on the field, and we cannot forget that. So it's really balancing those two. Our ethos when it comes to coverage, it's really three things. One is treat women athletes like athletes. Treat women's sports like sports, and use hype to drive the space, not guilt. So I'd say that is like the consistency across all of our coverage. And then certainly we're telling the human interest stories, but we're balancing that out with like showing the athletes on the field.
Got it. I would actually even push you a little bit more on that question and just want to follow up. When you say find the balance, how are you achieving that balance? Because we know that storytelling is important, but what's too much? We know fans of women's sports respond to what we call 360 degrees of storytelling, right? 365 days a year. They want to know not just the stats, the scores. They want to know that human element, but how do you find that balance?
Yeah, I don't have a precise formula for you. I don't know that one exists. I would love to ask that of our head of content and see what he had to say. Okay. But I think like we are all just first and foremost passionate women's sports fans, so we have a group to gut check our balance of content to. And then also going back to athlete first content is letting the athletes talk about whatever they want to talk about, whether that's their off the field endeavors, whether they're in a playoff race and it's all about on the field, or a combination of the two. So we certainly, when it comes to athlete hosted content or athlete led content, allow them to talk about whatever is meaningful to them.
I have to laugh because literally one of the conversations I had this morning with our head of content was exactly this topic, which is we're doing so much, we're covering these games, we've got 30 games a season, we've got our training sessions, but then we're also doing so many interesting things off the court in the field. Like, how do I balance this? How do I handle it? So I give her the unfair answer, which is we got to do it all. Like we have to do it all. It's the largest part of our team at Athletes Unlimited. We have a lot of great partners who help us execute the events and the leagues, and they have to be top quality, and the training has to be top quality. But then after that, it has to be the content and storytelling team. And one thing we have done is really invest in high-level quality broadcasts, but also really ensure that the social and digital first content. And one other way to do it, and I give Allie and her team incredible, props, because they were a great partner of ours in the basketball season, and our rights deals with our networks allowed us to share a lot of our footage directly, and we gave it over to her team, and her team was amazing at getting it out there. And so that's another thing we have to do, is find those smart partnerships where we can kind of syndicate and really partner to get the word out.
Ali G, hoping I'll come back to you and tell me if it's okay. I would love to know, what are some of the challenges that still exist as it relates to trying to formulate partnerships and be able to engage communities that might not be all the way immersed in women's sports, right, in the day-to-day? So how do you kind of get people to step back and really see the value and again, conquer those challenges?
Company, or just in general?
Just in general. I'm saying just in general.
Yeah, I think, look, it's growing depending on the sport or at different stages of maturity.
Yep.
So if you look at tennis, maybe at a later stage of maturity than, let's say, rugby, which we're a big player in women's rugby. And again, it goes to that, we're a little bit more in the grassroots area there. It does take effort, but I think one way to actually get people excited, again, is data, right? So you talked about content. You talked about how that content does really well. We've looked at stories. We try to show the power of these athletes, but also show the other side of their real lives. And that's the content that, at least from our perspective and what we're seeing in results, is really what's winning. Yeah. And so you take that, you address different audiences with that, and it really starts to change the dialogue internally and then externally as well.
John, Athletes Unlimited, you said just 2 years old, right? So still, I guess, maybe in its infancy in some ways. Absolutely. Right? But what do you see when you look forward? What's the opportunity that you see when you look forward for Athletes Unlimited and the women's sports landscape that's really untapped? So can you give us some insight into the opportunity that lies ahead?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the way I think we try to think about what we're doing is creating the best sports leagues in the world. And I think that for all of us that are operating in the women's sports world right now, I mean, I think we all lift our heads up and realize this is a much, much larger pie than any of us taking share from one another or even seeing it as this defined kind of space. I mean, the reality is a lot of fans of women's sports are also fans of men's sports. This is a big market opportunity that we want to seize. And I think, again, when you look at just women's sports as a media property, like, it's a great media property. It's not just a great women's sports media property. And that's what I think it's going to take to win. And I think that's what we have to do as Athletes Unlimited, is we have to realize that when somebody turns this on and watches a game or goes to our social channel, they have to walk away saying, this is awesome. Like, this is as good or as better than anything else I'm seeing out there. And so that's the way we're approaching it. As for where we go, we're expanding each of our seasons, as I mentioned, is 5 weeks in length. But this year, we're actually expanding our presence in softball with a new 2-week competition called AUX, which is going to take place in San Diego in June, and it'll be a complement. It'll mean more playing opportunities, more compensation, more games for fans to watch. And we believe in each of our sports there's kind of different growth trajectories, but I could see us doing more AUX competitions around the country, even around the world, where we bring kind of versions of our seasons to other parts of the world. And then, certainly down the road, we're going to be adding more sports to the network of Athletes Unlimited. And, there are a whole host of places that there are opportunities, and there are just so many places that we think we can continue to grow. So there's a lot of growth opportunities, both kind of in running our leagues and then all of the ancillary opportunities that come with being in this space.
Perfect. Ali B, Talk to me about the growth of the digital space, right? And it's so crowded with so many different content creators, specifically around women's sports, right? A little bit more grassroots style. Where are you seeing the biggest traction? Where are you seeing the biggest opportunity for more growth?
Yeah, so surprisingly, to most people, like our website is actually our biggest channel, which I think most people think it would be social, and it's not. And we've seen a pretty big shift in our website from just millennial women, and I don't mean just, it's a very valuable audience, but now it's actually 50-50 men and women. So we've seen, really going back to the Tokyo Olympics, and it's continued, is more and more men coming into our ecosystem, following women's sports and coming back. And then on social specifically, Twitter and Instagram were the fastest growing channels within women's sports, have been two we've focused on the most. I think part of it is we're a lean team, and so we're having to focus on a couple channels. I think we're really excited about some stuff coming up with Snapchat we have going on and TikTok, but certainly Twitter for just the news cycle, which is constant, and then Instagram for some of our more premium storytelling content.
You look like you had something to say,
No,
John,
I was just
please.
going to say, for us, you know, we, from in terms of our social presence, you know, Instagram's a big leader, Twitter, but for us, TikTok has been incredibly successful. It's been the platform we've kind of most outperformed on relative to almost any of the sport properties that are out there, and it's been awesome to see. And honestly, I attribute it in large part to, one, we've got some incredible content that we own and control and can put out there, but also literally it comes down to the people you have running that particular account who just kind of gets it and figures it out and can do it well. And so I've been blown away by kind of how powerful TikTok has been for us and how different the audiences, as we all know, on each platform are. So it's been a real success story for us.
Yeah, and I'm curious, John, what you think, but to your point of digital space is really crowded, like I don't know that that's true in women's sports. Like, I mean, certainly there's a lot of several different places you can get your news or your storytelling content, but it's just so dramatically different than the men's side, where people ask us about our competitors together, Highlight Her, The Gist, others, and really we're seeing like our fans follow multiple channels because it's just like not oversaturated yet. So you can follow and be fans. It's not like there's 50 different outlets you can get your women's sports media or news from.
Allie G, I'm gonna come back to you. What do you see as, from a brand perspective, right? What are you locked in on, maybe just from MasterCard's perspective as well? Like, what are some of the things that make a potential partnership attractive? When people are talking about, I wanna get started, I want a partner, I'm not quite sure, or what are brands really looking for? How would you advise them?
It's a great question. Do your homework, understand the brand that you're talking to, understand what we're about, you know, what we stand for, where we're invested, how we're activating. Show flexibility. You know, sort of that old model, that cookie cutter model that it's like, oh, here's what we do and here's what we give you, and, you know, just change the name of the brand. It just doesn't work. Really customizing and understanding what a brand's trying to achieve, and it might not be, you know, what everybody else wants, right? It might not be like the big sign or this or that. Maybe it's a content play. Maybe it's about connecting in and accessing, you know, amazing role models to be able to tell kind of an ongoing story. So it really, you know, to me, flexibility, being open, custom, and really understanding your customer is probably key.
I just got the nod. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to turn to our audience. If there's questions online, if there's questions here in our live audience, I'll open it up. Yeah, please. Can we get one second? Let me get you a microphone. Ask away.
Thank you. Because I got 3 daughters, so I'm curious, how do you reach out to non-traditional female athletes, particularly female athletes with disabilities from different places who may not be able to get into emerging sports leagues? Do you think about esports and online gaming, sports like that? Is it a potential possibility?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I can take that. At least from a MasterCard perspective, esports is a major focus area for us. So traditional sport, really all the passions across the board, arts, entertainment, but esports is definitely a focus of ours. We actually work with a shoutcaster, Shocks, who's one of our ambassadors. We're heavily engaged in League of Legends esports across the globe. So that's definitely an area where I feel like we can engage a broader audience.
Any other questions? Yes.
I was just curious.
Hold on, wait for the mic.
We'll wait for the mic.
I'm a family person. So I've heard a lot about the individual athlete, and I'm curious about where the family fan is and what's happening to the fan as a family and it being part of that shared experience. If we're looking at, everything's individual, we're streaming it ourselves, and, athletes are, we're raising a profile of one athlete. Like, where's the community and community experience?
So I'll address that. So I think that one of the things, again, as I mentioned, the Athletes Unlimited model is we do focus a lot on the individual athletes. However, and the misconception, I think, actually, which you're putting forth is, oh my gosh, this is cutthroat, individual versus individual. We've found, and what is the premise of our model, is actually what ends up happening is the entire league, the 44 athletes that are there, the 60 athletes, literally all become one community. And so, first of all, the athletes have to perform each week on their team. There's a lot of bonding that goes on. But then you really build this sense that the league is that community. And that is what fans buy into and they come to understand, and you see uplifted. And so that's been really powerful. And then what we're trying to do even one step beyond that is build this community of athletes across sports, which really doesn't happen except in the Olympics. I mean, and maybe at the NCAA level. But one thing I'm always shocked about is when I talk to players and athletes in our leagues, they'll say, my life has always been in the world of volleyball. Like, I never talked to anyone from basketball. And so we actually connect athletes that join. When you join our volleyball league, for example, and you're new, we connect you with a mentor from one of the other sports to talk to you and have these shared experiences. We also run and have a racial equity working group, and we've had other working groups which involve athletes across the leagues. And so that team ethos is deeper than ever, and especially because the athletes are driving the decision-making and self-organizing and doing a lot of things. And I think what has happened too much in pro sports today, and I argue that with the, free agency is a wonderful thing, but there is a lot less team ethos in professional sports today than there maybe has been in the past. And I think that's a wonderful thing because I believe the athletes should be uplifted. But I think the model today in most traditional leagues is a lot of players moving from team to team, coming in and out, feeling like they're going to be in the league most career tenures are 3.5 years, 4 years, and then they know they're gone. And for us, we've had this long-term profit-sharing arrangement. So for us, I think, if anything, the fan of Athletes Unlimited comes away feeling like they are part of this community, the athletes are going to be part of the community, and they've been involved in every level of decision-making. So I think it's awesome and a big part of it. And then you get into fan behavior like co-watching and the fan attendance and everything else that has to happen. But
Anything else? Okay, great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the time and the conversation. That concludes our panel.